This video is a bit of an experiment because I'm going to be telling you why I think that the minimum wage should not be $0. But before that, I'm going to tell you why I think the minimum wage should be $0. But before that, I'm going to read to you a Reddit comment. But before that, I'm going to talk to you about housing policy. So if that sort of order of events sounds compelling or interesting to you, then strap in because that's what we're doing. Okay, first, housing policy. I'm going to quote extensively from an article by Ryan Pazicki called The Banished Bottom of the Housing Market: How America Destroyed Its Cheapest Homes. As late as 1990, as many as 2 million people lived in residential hotels, more than lived in all of America's public housing, according to Paul Groth, author of Living Downtown. Today, not so much. It says the cheapest form of residential hotels were specializing in furnished single rooms for individuals, usually with shared kitchens and bathrooms. Variously and derogatorily known by many names, rooming houses, lodging houses, flop houses, SROs provided affordable, market rate housing to those at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. It's a great idea, but in many cities it's illegal. The urbanity of SROs collided head on with the moralism of the progressive era. They pathologized home dwellers as friendless, isolated, and blamed rooming houses for loneliness and moral disorder. Economic and policy shifts hastened their decline. Industrial jobs moved to peripheral locations only accessible by car, urban highway expansion targeted lodging house neighborhoods, and cities encouraged office developments on increasingly valuable downtown land. Their disappearance from the housing supply explains much of modern-day homelessness. Today, in many American metropolises, restrictions abound, from zoning that bans shared housing to minimum unit size rules that outlaw SRO scale rooms. Okay, so I'm very sympathetic to these sorts of housing policies, right? Number one, because of libertarianism, belief in free markets, let people build whatever housing there is supply for. Number two, because of I already sort of believe in urbanity movements and principles of walkability and the importance of beautiful areas, beautiful neighborhoods, walkable neighborhoods, good public transportation, etc. Number three, because I believe in supporting young people in our construction of housing to have housing supply for younger people like myself who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford housing. And so, for a combination of reasons, obviously, me as the target audience for this article and other things I haven't even named, like the fact that I, browse in internet forums that are very sympathetic to this kind of thing, I am naturally the kind of person to absolutely support this article. At the same time, I think I was wondering to myself, okay, am I not giving the devil its due? Or is this article not sort of um, giving the other side of the story? This article definitely casts the progressive reformers of the era as being the villains of the story, but I have to wonder, were they right? Because maybe these flop houses, these SROs, just didn't have the amenities that were typically available. Maybe it was a horrible place to live, horrible form of living. And the people of the time, they would look at the SROs and say, gee, could we be doing better than this? Could we be building better housing than this? In the same way, if you go to like the slums in South America, you could say, okay, fine, these slums are cheap places to live. But someone could cast a story years later, these are cheap places to live. But realistically, don't we think that these people should be living in places with better amenities and better construction? So is that what was going on here? How I encountered this article was on a subreddit called Slate Star Codex subreddit. It's the subreddit for the blog, and I went into the comments and I found a comment that sort of addressed this, and I want to read that comment fully verbatim because I think it's a really great comment that addresses the concern that I had. This is a comment from Electrance, which I'm going to be quoting most of it. He says, this general trend where we raise the standards of what counts as minimum, often with the explicit goal to help the bottom, sometimes well intentioned, other times not, is very common. I recall a couple years ago, someone argued that the federal minimum wage should be set at a quote living wage. I pointed out that living wage didn't really mean anything. until you put a number on what specifically that means. And after some back and forth, I finally got a number, 70K USD, which is more than the median wage. On either the same thread or a related one, I remember someone saying that no one should have to live in a one-bedroom house. They should have to build 2+ bedroom apartments. Apparently, to this person, it was cruelty to suggest that the average American man be allowed to live in a place without having an entire extra bedroom they don't use. And I think the same instinct drives people to advocate for these types of things. When what they're saying in their head is, I wish people lived comfortable lives. And then it becomes, it is unacceptable to not live a life I consider comfortable, which then becomes, we should ban things that I consider uncomfortable, then everyone will live comfortably. So when someone suggests something like, we should allow studio apartments to be built or similar, then they are seen in reverse as saying, it is acceptable to live a life I consider uncomfortable, which then becomes, I wish people lived uncomfortable lives, which often goes one step further into, I don't care about the less well off, and if I had it my way, we would have all the undesirables living eternally in capsule hotels, all while serving me at my pleasure for the scraps that fill my table. And this is why economics education is so important. People don't suggest things like studio apartments or SROs because they hate the people who live in them. They do it because making something the minimum standard just means taking away options for those who see it as their best option. Okay, so this is the part where I discuss the minimum wage. This video can be seen as a bit of an addendum to my other much longer video where I talk about how some things in economics that people think of as obviously bad are actually good. This relates to sort of the first section on price gouging, price fixing, because the minimum wage is like a minimum price scheme. But also, it relates maybe to the layoff section, but you don't have to watch that. And obviously, I'm not an economist or anything. Um, I'm just going to give a few things to chew on regarding the minimum wage, but don't worry because I'm going to not be one-sided about it, and hopefully I'll give some reframings or information that you didn't think of before. So there are a few ways to look at, from a policy perspective, the empirical side of what we think will happen or what we observe happens when you institute the government intervention of a higher minimum wage, right? The most obvious way is you can look at rates of unemployment. How you look at that, I mean, it's hard to isolate. You have to look at differences between like different counties that have it or don't, lower or higher amounts, but the amount typically isn't that far apart. Maybe two different counties that are similar tend to have similar minimum wages, but it's not different by that much. Or you can look at longitudinal surveys about if you track like an area raises the minimum wage, how does that affect unemployment? But I am a little bit skeptical about unemployment itself as a measure, and economists like aren't stupid, they know these things, but unemployment is, how do you even define that? Because let's say over a long enough time span, it just becomes accepted that people don't look for work in certain conditions. Like in the past, it was more common for teenagers to hold jobs, and then when the higher minimum wage, it's harder for them to get jobs, hypothetically, so teenagers don't tend to look for jobs as much. That's not counted as unemployment, it's more like labor force participation rate because they're discouraged workers. So hopefully there are other ways to measure that. The other way that's most common to measure, you can look at like elasticity of labor demand. That's saying when you raise the price of labor, to what extent does that hurt employment? One paper that I have seen cited before is Beyond the Debate, a meta-analysis of minimum wage studies by Thomas Esterbrook. And I'm going to show a graphic. The negative bars show that there is a negative relationship between the price of labor and the employment, which is what marginalism economics logic would suggest, which is just saying that raising the minimum wage by raising the floor on the labor, it would cause layoffs to occur. So as you can see on this chart, most of these studies that is, most of the bars show that there is a negative relationship, which is sort of a point against the minimum wage. It's showing that if you raise that floor on the wages, it will lead to less employment, which is obviously bad. However, the other thing you have to take into account is when you read through this paper and papers like this, you start to realize that there are so many of these second order effects that, unlike a very numeric and crude measure such as labor elasticity, if it's a weird, like, socioeconomic effect of the minimum wage, it could be pro minimum wage, it could be anti minimum wage, it's some sort of effect, but how do you take that into account? For example, I want to make sure I take a second to explain this correctly. The paper says that by instituting a higher minimum wage, then companies could compensate by lowering the wages of other laborers, like in fast food restaurants, who are on the higher end of the pay scale, but now it can't pay them as much. So they're still not being paid a ton, but it lowers those wages. And the overall effect it calls wage compression. So normally wage compression is considered a good thing. It's like less inequality of the wages between the different people. But if you're talking about it's limited to only certain industries like fast food, where everyone who's a frontline worker is already being paid a relatively low amount. Is that necessarily what you want? You should want to see a higher career ladder where people begin as teenagers. Over the course of their career, they can climb higher and higher, and when they're store managers, now they're being paid a higher amount. And so there are like these social effects where people want to see progression in their careers. And how do you factor that in? In economics, there's also the concept of sticky wages, which is a bad thing. It contributes to recessions being worse than they otherwise would be. How this would manifest here is since the minimum wages of regulation requires a certain wage, companies during times of recession, it would be more difficult for them to hire people when they need to hire more workers. Because let's say they can't pay that amount. Now they're not rehiring people, which is prolonging the recession. So when you first institute the minimum wage, you're not going to see the effect right away. So when you're recording these studies, you need to take into account that long-term effect of like the business cycle of when will eventually the recession come around, and might make things worse. On the other hand, and I'm not going to go too much into this because it dovetails into the response, um, it could be a good or bad thing depending on how you think about it, but you might not be able to directly record any impact as much as you would predict there would be, because uh, when you institute these sort of regulations, the market, it's odd to say, but it's in some ways clever enough and innovative enough to find these weird workarounds that sort of disguise the problem, or like you would predict that there would be more unemployment, but there's other like structural changes in the economy that account for that, that make it so that the unemployment you predict there would be, well, the economy still is affected, perhaps in a negative way, but it disguises that. For example, like industries that are disproportionately affected by this, according to my logic, are going to be industries that are disproportionately impacted by the business cycle. Maybe the actual distortion of the market is not um, directly less employment across the board, but instead a distortion on what kinds of industries there are. Like those kinds of industries decline in favor of other kinds of industries. So, is that a good or bad thing? Well, it's a distortion. Could be some sort of deadweight loss, but we'll get more into that later. I also recorded a rant about how I dislike the crudeness with which people on the left discuss the minimum wage as if all you have to do is raise the number, and then magically, no matter what you set it to, it's going to automatically mean that people get paid more. But I am not gonna include that because I think that's kind of obvious from what I believe. And yeah, it's more complex than that. It's supply and demand. The true minimum wage is and always will be $0 unless you make it illegal to fire people like they do in Europe. So I'm not going to harp on that. You can make a really kind of gotcha libertarian argument for why the minimum wage should be $0, which is technically, if the minimum wage would be $0, there would be zero unemployment because unemployment is defined as people who want a job but are unable to get a job. And if the minimum wage would be zero, well, anyone could find a job, some job, because if you're willing to work for 1 penny an hour, well, there's someone out there willing to pay you 1 penny an hour to do something. So technically, there you go, problem solved, zero unemployment. But do you buy it? Really, who wants to work for a penny an hour? That's the issue. I will, though, tell you a kind of dumb reframing that did, for a period of time, convince me that the minimum wage should be $0, which is that the minimum wage law, taken literally, means it says that it's illegal for you to have a job if you're sufficiently poor. What? I mean, why does it say that? Well, let's say the minimum wage was $10 and they raise it to $15. It's saying that if your wage falls below a certain threshold, then you can't have that job for that wage anymore. So you can't work for $10 an hour anymore. You can only work for $15 an hour. And people will assume, okay, well, your boss is going to account for that by bumping your wage from $10 to $15. But the minimum wage law itself doesn't say your boss is forced to bump up your wage. He can just fire you. He doesn't have to bump up your wage. So all that it really says is that it's illegal for you to hold that job for that wage anymore. If you're sufficiently poor, which poor meaning you may make $10 an hour, you can't do that anymore. You're not allowed to have a job. You're not allowed to have that job for that wage. You buy that? QED, that's my argument. Do you think that now the minimum wage should be $0? Well, probably you don't. So I'm going to present to you the other side of the coin and hopefully something else to consider here. There was a paper put out by authors Rao and Risch called Who's Afraid of the Minimum Wage? Measuring the Impacts on Independent Businesses Using Matched U.S. Tax Returns. And it says that a higher minimum wage, it causes creative destruction in the industry. It results in fewer but more productive firms. It's kind of like if you have the small brain, it says minimum wage is good because it doesn't cause anyone to lose their jobs. And then medium brain person says minimum wage is bad because it causes people to lose their jobs. Big brain obviously says minimum wage is good because it causes people to lose their jobs. Because that's part of creative destruction. FDR, when he was first instituting the federal minimum wage, he's quoted as saying, "No business which depends for existence on paying less than living wages to its workers has any right to continue in this country." And if you read that, that is just the most like mind-breaking to any libertarian who reads that. You don't understand. Why would you deliberately cause that, even if it sounds good on paper? But there actually is something to that, because maybe you want to weed out a certain number of firms that operate in a certain kind of way and institute that change. It's like survival of the fittest. We understand in economics that the way that generally markets are supposed to work is that it's based on like the evolutionary nature analogous to natural selection. You have diversity within the firms in the market, and then some of those firms, they don't operate efficiently, they go bankrupt, and then of the remaining firms, they grow and become more influential, and there's selection in who enters the market, and there's also selection in who survives within the market. In the same way, in natural selection, not everyone survives, not everyone is able to propagate their genetic information. And something like raising the minimum wage, in a similar way that regulations make it more difficult for the market to function, you can sort of make a reverse psychology form of argument that says, isn't that sort of good to raise the barrier to entry? Because it's sort of analogous to if there's an ice age and that raises the temperature in the environment, and then a few species go extinct, then the species that make it through the ice age, they'll be more productive, right? So just raising that bar at the cost of participating in the market, it has a distortionary effect, but is that good or bad? The minimum wage can be modeled as a tax on companies which rely on the lowest of low-cost labor, and a subsidy to corporations that rely on slightly higher cost labor in multiple different ways. Number one, is if the minimum wage does cause layoffs, then that's more unemployed persons, which means there's more ready, accessible supply of labor for firms that are hiring. A larger hiring pool means it's easier for them to drive the price down and pay people lower wages. Second, this is partially related, is what we talked about earlier with the wage compression, where what firms do is they shift things around so that people who were previously on less than minimum wage, when you raise the number, then you pay those people more. But since now your profits are lower, you compensate by taking your higher paid employees and paying them less. Well, imagine how that shifts around who the players are in the market. If you're one of those companies that used to pay the lowest paid employees and now you have to pay them more, that hurts you, as opposed to if you're a company that paid slightly higher paid employees, now you get to pay them less, that benefits you. What does that all result in? It's fewer small independent businesses and more large corporations that operate on lower margins and more economies of scale. And this is described as the creative destruction of the Nordic model. Explained by the economist Roberto Lacano, wage compression functions as a tax on low productivity enterprises and a subsidy for high productivity enterprises. This idea is well known in the Nordics. I've never seen it anywhere else. It reshapes the nature of the industry. It was also said creative destruction is also the most underappreciated reason for why high minimum wages can improve economic efficiency. So, do you buy this now? I don't know if I buy it, but I think it's at least plausible. I mean, government interventions, even if they intend to or not, they can reshape the composition and nature of industries in the economy. And maybe that has a sort of long term growth as the economy specializes in a particular kind of way. What makes it click in my brain is, I guess you can make analogies to different countries with natural resources. You may have heard of like the curse of resources, where a lot of oil rich countries, they end up actually not having a lot of economic development because although they have the oil revenues, there's no incentive for the corrupt leaders to spend any investment into improving the economy. All you have to do is create the roads which run between your port and the drilling sites. Whereas if you're a more complex industry like complex manufacturing, you look at Taiwan, big chip manufacturers, that's going to benefit many levels of the supply chain in order to support that. Because in order to create such a complex thing, you're going to have training programs, advanced educational programs. This is going to benefit the population at large. Similarly, if you look at Singapore, they don't have basically any natural resources at all. They're basically a rock in the middle of Southeast Asia, and they basically export like IQ based industries, like IQ products, like financial services and whatnot. And because they don't have any resources, they're forced to specialize in these like IQ heavy products to export. Of course, that was unintentional, but none of these things are intentional. You've probably heard of the economics concept of comparative advantage, that countries should export the good or service which plays the best to their comparative advantage. But some people point out kind of the missing piece there is the question, how did you end up as one or another industry becoming the comparative advantage industry in the first place? Because it's not an accident, except it is very much an accident. It's happenstance. These sort of policy choices, whether the government intends it or not, they can have an influence over sort of what is that industry that becomes the competitive leading industry in the economy that captures those economies of scale and captures most of the effort of the country. The effect that the minimum wage has on reshaping the industry, that could have some like weird third order effect that I'm describing now. None of that was intentional, but whether it's good or bad is very complex.